This episode discusses violence against women and systemic failures in policing. Listener discretion is advised. In the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, women began disappearing from Vancouver's downtown Eastside. At first, it seemed isolated. A missing person here, another there. But then the names started to accumulate. Daughters, mothers, sisters, friends, many of them Indigenous, many of them struggling with poverty or addiction, many of them doing what they needed to survive. For years, families searched for answers. For years, warnings went unheard. And eventually, those disappearances would lead investigators to a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, and to a man named Robert Pickton. But this story is not just about a serial killer. It's about whose lives are protected and whose are overlooked. This is The Farm That Hid the Truth. To understand what happened, we need to understand the setting. Vancouver's downtown Eastside has long been one of Canada's most economically marginalized neighborhoods. High rates of poverty, addiction, housing instability, sex work. Many of the women who lived and worked there were Indigenous, part of communities already impacted by generations of systemic trauma. Through the 1990s, women began vanishing. Families reported them missing. Some reports were taken seriously. Others were met with indifference. There was an assumption, sometimes spoken, sometimes not, that these women were transient, that they would come back, that they had simply moved on. But the families knew something was wrong. Community advocates began sounding alarms. By the late 1990s, dozens of women had disappeared, and still, no coordinated response. Looking back now, it's clear the warning signs were there, but they weren't treated as urgent. About 40 kilometers east of Vancouver, in Port Coquitlam, stood a pig farm owned by the Pickton family. It was isolated, private, and according to some who visited, unsettling. Robert William Pickton lived there with his brother. He was known locally as socially awkward, quiet, not particularly polished. The farm became known for parties, chaotic gatherings where drugs and alcohol were common. Women from the downtown East Side were reportedly seen there. Some would never be seen again. Rumors circulated in the community, but rumors aren't evidence, and without strong investigative momentum, nothing moved forward. In 1997, a woman escaped from the farm after a violent encounter. She reported that Robert Pickton had attacked her. He was arrested, charged with attempted murder and assault. But the charges were stayed. The case did not proceed. In hindsight, many consider this one of the most significant missed opportunities in the entire investigation. Because during those same years, more women were disappearing. Police departments debated whether a serial predator was operating in Vancouver. Jurisdictional conflicts between the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP complicated matters. Information wasn't always shared effectively, and the pattern continued. In February 2002, police executed a search warrant at Pickton's farm. The original reason? Illegal firearms. What they discovered changed everything. Evidence connected to missing women began to surface. The investigation expanded immediately. Forensic teams descended on the farm in what would become one of the largest and most complex crime scene investigations in Canadian history. The property search lasted months. The scale was staggering. Eventually, Robert Pickton was charged with the murders of 26 women. He would later claim the number was higher. Over time, investigators pieced together a pattern. Robert Pickton targeted women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside, many of whom were vulnerable due to poverty, addiction, or involvement in sex work. He would approach them under the pretense of offering money, drugs, or a place to go. Some were driven to his farm in Port Coquitlam. What happened next was reconstructed through forensic evidence, witness testimony, and statements Pickton later made to an undercover officer. Authorities determined that Pickton killed the women inside a trailer on the property. The method, according to court findings, involved shooting the victims. Afterward, evidence suggested he attempted to conceal the crimes by disposing of remains on the farm. Forensic teams recovered DNA belonging to multiple victims across the property, in buildings, vehicles, and personal items. The investigation became one of the most complex forensic operations in Canadian history, and during the trial, prosecutors laid out how Pickton had operated for years without being stopped. In 2007, Robert Pickton was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence allowed under Canadian law at the time. The remaining charges were stayed in 2010. Prosecutors stated that pursuing further trials would place an enormous emotional burden on the families, and that Pickton would never be released regardless. For many families, the outcome brought partial closure, but it also raised painful questions. Why did it take so long? Could more lives have been saved? In the aftermath, the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry was launched. The findings were deeply critical. The inquiry cited blatant failures in the investigation. It found that systemic bias played a role in how disappearances were handled, particularly regarding Indigenous women and women involved in sex work. The case became a national reckoning. It forced conversations about policing priorities, marginalization, institutional bias, and accountability. Because the central tragedy wasn't just what one man did, it was how long it took for anyone to act decisively. Today, memorials exist to honor the women whose lives were taken. Families continue to advocate for reform and awareness. The case remains one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history, but it is also a reminder that every life matters, that vulnerability should never equal invisibility, and that justice delayed can mean justice denied. Years after his conviction, Robert Pickton remained incarcerated in Canada's federal prison system. He was serving a life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence under Canadian law at the time of his conviction. In 2024, more than 2 decades after his arrest, Pickton died following an assault by another inmate inside the prison where he was being held. His death closed a chapter legally, but not emotionally. For some, it marked the end of a long and painful era. For others, it changed nothing, because the story was never about the man alone. It was about the women whose disappearances were dismissed. It was about the families who fought for attention when few were listening. And it was about a system that failed to act when the warning signs were already there. Pickton died behind bars, never eligible for release. But the deeper questions raised by the case remain. How do institutions respond when marginalized communities report harm? How do we ensure patterns are recognized sooner? And how do we prevent vulnerability from being mistaken for invisibility? This story is painful, but telling it matters, because behind every headline was a human being, a daughter, a sister, a friend. If you'd like to support organizations that advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women, resources will be included in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and take care of each other.